Hi, I'm Jim Clark, Visual Arts Manager here at Hopkins Center for the Arts. We're speaking with Ger Xiong this morning about his exhibition, The Stories We Carry. Ger, welcome.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. Can you tell us about the specific inspiration for this series of work?
Yeah, so a lot of this work came back from my travels to Thailand, actually. So when I came back, I really wanted to create like visual narratives, visual in a way where people can kind of see what the stories are within the tapestry pieces. So I came back and I wanted to look at more of my own family's history and our migration from Laos to Thailand and then to the United States. And then I kind of questioned myself, like, how do I make that kind of work into my own kind of narratives and that fits into my own practice. So it's kind of like the beginning, like parts of the inspiration of it. And then utilizing like a good amount of like Hmong iconographies and symbols and coloration into the work.
About when did this originate? Has this been percolating forever, or is this a recent development in your practice?
Yeah, like the body of work. It's like a recent one. So I knew like I always wanted to make like these narrative tapestry for a while now. So when I was in school, I had kind of the tools and equipment to make it. So I decided to kind of make my own kind of tapestry. Yeah.
Cool. And as far as the content of the work, I mean, it's very personal. It's
yeah.
your story. Did digging into this work change your perspective on your personal histories? Were these things that you'd always been thinking about, or did they come to the fore more recently?
Pretty recently too. Like I think a lot of my work is really kind of personal in a way, but I think making this work kind of brought me kind of closer to like my own history and then my relationship with my like family.
Sure.
Because I had to like do interviews with them. I just kind of talked to them about like what year did we actually cross the river to Thailand to get to the camp? What year did like we actually come to the United States? What specific like dates? So a lot of that has kind of helped me kind of build those relationships with some family members.
How much of the work, the narrative of the work is your story, and maybe how much is collectively your family's? I mean, is it really a familial thing, or is it more individual?
So I think most of them are kind of like collectively, and then like parts and pieces, like the purple one behind you is kind of more personal, where I talk more about like my experience like from different places to one another. And now some of these are like coming from like historical histories and events that happened throughout the Vietnam War till today. Yeah.
I think for many people, it's maybe surprising, though it probably shouldn't be, that the Vietnam War and its repercussions are the ripples of that are continuing to be felt today. Have you encountered more surprise about that than maybe you would expect?
I think that's kind of what my expectations were actually, like like people not knowing that history and the ripple effects of it, and yeah, especially for like, because I grew up in Wisconsin and I moved to Minnesota, especially for these communities too, like that has a good amount of Hmong population in them. A lot of folks actually don't really know much of our history and our background and the effects of the Vietnam War. So I think I kind of like expected that actually, like people not knowing our history, right? Because this did come off from like the CIA, and a lot of that was like more like we call it the secret war. Like people actually didn't know about the things that happened during that time.
Yeah, and the response met your expectations essentially.
Yeah.
And you came here in 1993, which even in itself seems, there's a wide stretch between what we think of as that war in that time. So it's quite remarkable and eye-opening.
Yeah, it is,
The style and medium of the work. Number one, could you speak to why these materials? You use fabric and thread and some found objects, or maybe, and found object kind of fails here in that, I mean, these were intentionally sourced things that you wanted to incorporate, like the beer cans, or the House resolution, the legal language. Can you tell us how this medium use developed, and have you always used these mediums, or have you worked in other mediums previously?
Yeah. So I did my undergrad BFA in metals and jewelry. So my background's in metals and jewelry, so metalsmithing. I didn't really explore textiles until I got to like graduate school, where I kind of like started shifting towards like textile work, and then now like kind of like a culmination of both within the work. So you kind of see it with that piece and the necklace piece up here. So I think like in my core, I am considered kind of myself like a metalsmith or a jeweler, but I do textile work as well.
Sure.
But a lot of the techniques and processes, I try to utilize them with traditional craft, Hmong craft, and processes. So using like Hmong narrative stories and tapestry as kind of an influence for these forms. So like you kind of see like the borders are very similar to like the traditional Hmong tapestry pieces.
In form or color use?
Form
both?
and colors,
Form and color,
form and color, yep. So form is like the borders, and then like the blue and these colors that I use throughout the pieces. And then process-wise, I knew I kind of wanted, usually when I work with processes, I try to incorporate like kind of the handmade versus like the machine made. So a lot of this, I like use Illustrator for it. So I design everything on Illustrator, and then I put it into the embroidery software. It digitizes my design, and I put that into the embroidery machine, and it would embroider your design for you.
Yeah.
And I want to bring in back like the hand making processes. So I like did the text with just hand embroidering the text on top of them. And then all the bars that they hang on are hand fabricated.
And were these processes ones that you developed while making this work, or is that something that you'd had a hand in forever? Was it something that you learned from your family, or something that you learned in school, kind of reaching back?
Yeah, so like the machine and everything, I learned that in school. Some of the hand embroidery I would learn from my mother, where I just like look at her like kind of like cross stitching and her kind of embroidery, and can mimic kind of those patterns and those colors.
Yeah. The imagery is stylized in a way that I would characterize as childlike. I hope that you're okay with that
I mean, that's what a lot of people say.
But the content is very strong, very challenging, and I think that friction between the childlike imagery and the violent nature of a lot of the stories amplifies the heartbreak. Because you really are telling stories of children. Your experience, that of your families. Was this, like, how intentional was this move going into it? Did you envision these works looking like this from the get-go, or were there some false starts or some development to get to this style?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I like envisioned it like as it was going to become like kind of like childlike or childlike within the narratives. I think that really came like midway through, and when I started like seeing them actually come together, where it kind of behind like what you were saying, like have that friction of like, it looks very childlike, but it has like that very kind of violent message to it, right? But I really enjoy that kind of like friction between both of that actually. And yeah, so I actually didn't come up at that until like halfway through.
Really?
Yeah. When I was kind of drawing it onto, and actually putting them onto the tapestry itself, because I feel like it looks different when you see it digitally, and then you see it like in person, an actual like tapestry piece.
the textural aspects of it are so important. And did you imagine that as you were working in Illustrator, which is so flat? Did you have a sense, or were you a bit surprised with how alive? I mean, I would characterize them as coming quite alive with the way they engage with 3 dimensions. Was that a surprise a bit, or?
No, I don't think so, because I think like just looking at, I think when I look at like different like forms of art, I feel like this one, I kind of knew, because I knew how like the Hmong tapestry traditionally looked. I kind of like, we're kind of expecting this kind of narrative and this kind of look to it.
Sure.
And and the texture and everything from it.
These works, and maybe your process isn't monolithic, but do they come about with an idea? Like how conceived do you think of that final work, or is it more responsive? And do you start with hand drawings, or do you jump right into Illustrator and start working away?
So with that, like usually with that process, I usually like write it out first, like write out what narrative I
verbally.
want to.
Language.
Okay. So I just like rather like I'm writing like full sentences, or like free writing what narrative I'm trying to like think about, and then I'll kind of start hand drawing like some sketches and placing like things in particular orders, and then I will go on to Illustrator, and then I will essentially just build off of Illustrator of what my drawings were, and then I'll just add things here and there, like where I need to put like certain trees or certain things or the environment. And then I will and then I will start just adding things onto it, onto the Illustrator pieces.
And for folks that don't know Illustrator, and many people are maybe more familiar with Photoshop, but Illustrator is vector-based, and things are infinitely scalable. But are you drawing things and then pushing them around to find composition? Like you create an element and then you're moving it until it finds its place, or do you have it kind of mapped out in your head and you just go from one corner to the other?
I think I kind of have it mapped up in my head. I guess it's kind of a little more intuitive when I'm making, so especially on the Illustrator. So I kind of think about what I kind of see in my head. And I was like, okay, I think I like over there, like that piece over there, like I want the people to be running towards this empty space. So I try to put them, as many people around that space as much as I want, and then have like kind of percolating out. And then I would kind of like put the trees, just kind of showing like the mountainous space of Laos in that piece. So I have like some parts that I know like I want things to be in, but then it kind of becomes intuitive when I'm kind of making on that.
That piece in particular, that void, is then represented in another piece in the show. And how did that relationship come about? And do you think of those two pieces in particular being in conversation with each other, or are they really, in your mind, quite separate?
I do see them in conversation with each other. So I think when I was making this kind of series, I wanted like not to just replicate like traditional like Hmong tapestry. I wanted to put my own voice and narrative into it. So I really wanted to show kind of the loss and the erasure of history and people into these pieces. So for that piece in particular, I knew that I wanted to cut this piece away to kind of show that loss and erasure, but also show what happens when you're able to put back a narrative onto the full narrative. What does it mean to go back to a story and reclaim that space, the empty space, with a jewelry piece that you kind of wear around? So asking questions like, what does it mean to take this piece on and off from a bigger narrative, and then what does it mean to kind of carry that narrative with you, like parts of that narrative, and then also what does it mean to come back and reclaim that space by putting it back on?
So are there times where you display that work with this piece back on?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So it hangs on magnets, so it just goes on and off.
And what are the conditions on which you choose that display? Or is it curator's choice?
I actually don't have any conditions. So it's usually like if I apply it for show and I have that piece together, I would apply it like that. And then if I apply it separately, then I have it separate. But I do like it having like sometimes them in the same space and sometimes them not in the same space. So I don't actually have any conditions on that.
That itself, though, and I'm going to give you full credit for this, it's a beautiful metaphor. I mean, I think we all feel fluidly between having it all together and not so much. And this is your personal narrative.
Yeah.
I imagine there are days that you feel maybe more, and I'll put it whole, and maybe that's not the correct word, but like in tune with your culture and history, and also functioning right now. And that there are other times where it feels like those two things are out of phase. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is. That's like exactly. It's kind of like how my work is kind of all about, like really kind of like the constant like navigating and the negotiation of like identity in these different places. Like sometimes I do want to talk about emotiveness. Sometimes I don't. Like I don't want to talk about it.
Right.
So like how do you kind of like transition from that, like those different spaces from one another, you know? So sometimes I like do really like, because it's a lot of heavy narrative and a lot of heavy like history. Sometimes it is a lot to take in, and sometimes it's hard to kind of take all that in. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Are you still working through this in your work, or have you moved on to other content?
I'm still kind of thinking about this work, but I'm moving towards like some different kind of content kind of work. I'm still trying to get an embroidery machine, so I don't have like an embroidery machine anymore. So if I do get like an embroidery machine where I can make these pieces again, I think I would continue this series of work.
Sure.
But I'm kind of like moving right now, making work of like jewelry work and more textile-based work, kind of combination of both, doing more cross-stitching.
Cool. Where can we keep up with you, Ger?
Yeah, I have my website, it's gerxiong.com, and then I have my social media, and I think my website would probably be the best way to keep up with me. And the social media too, if anyone uses social media. Yeah.
Cool. Let's open it up to any questions.
Your work is really impressive. Can you speak a little bit about the role of the tapestry in traditional Hmong culture and the people that influenced you the most from your history? Would that be your mother?
Yeah, for sure, my mom. So I grew up with a single mother. My dad passed in the war, so we came to the United States. It was my mom that raised 8 of us by herself in Wisconsin. So she worked like, I think like 2 to 3 jobs when we were growing up. So a lot of this kind of like gives kind of like an homage to kind of my mom's making and her history of kind of coming to the United States and kind of raising her kids by herself. But yeah, so she's probably one of my biggest influence, just making these work, especially like textile work too. And then, but the role of craft, I feel like, especially these story narrative ones, they came out when we were in the refugee camps. So they became like, the role of it was really kind of documenting our history because our future was kind of unknown. So like a lot of NGOs in that space were telling like folks to make these more narrative work because historically a lot of our like textile work were more symbolic, where we're cross-stitching like symbols and patterns. So more these narrative ones of people and things onto the pieces. They wanted us to document that. And also it became as a way to like financially support families in the camp. So a lot of people were coming through buying like the textile work and then selling and then giving them to friends and family, like in the United States or something.
And what part of the country was your family from?
So my family is originally from Laos, and
Laos.
then Laos. We were in the Singkhon province there.
That's where the Hmong people are from.
So we're considered indigenous to like Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, and then the southern region of China. So we're not from like a particular country, but we're considered indigenous in those areas. And then after the war, then we were dispersed throughout the world into these third world countries here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So was the tapestry storytelling a transition from verbal storytelling at some point? Was this like you needed to have a physical thing to tell your story in order to keep it?
Yeah, I think if we're thinking about, because Hmong is an oral tradition, so a lot of this did become a part of like documenting our history. And I'm not sure if like we needed this, but it became kind of like another form of just documenting what our history is. And document in ways where you kind of read it, and if you don't understand Hmong, you can kind of still read and know what that history is. But yeah.
How long were you in a camp?
My family was there from, I believe, like mid-'80s till '93. So I was there only for like less than I was born like less than a year old. So a lot of my upbringing was in the United States. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have older siblings that I imagine stories come up when at family events and whatnot? How much you probably don't personally remember, but maybe you have a sense of the feeling of the space. Is that fair to say?
I actually don't remember. I don't have any like sense of space, feeling the space at all.
Yeah,
So a lot of my upbringing was in the U.S. here.
Yeah.
But a lot of my siblings do remember kind of our time from the transition from Laos over to Thailand. A few of my siblings were the ones that crossed the river over to the refugee camps, and then the most of my other siblings were then born in the camps.
How did you happen to end up in the U.S., and how was the transition? I suppose you were too young to remember much.
So we have families here first before we came, so they were the ones that sponsored us. So we had I think my brother and them, he came here around the late, he was the first or second wave, I think came in the early 80s or something. And then they were able to sponsor us when we came in '93 to the United States. So we landed, I think, then we came to Green Bay, and then we went down to the Appleton, the Fox Valley area in Wisconsin, and resided there.
Is the land, as far as what you've heard from your family, is that area similar, except for the mountains?
Compared to
where you came from?
No. So we came in December, so it was snowing obviously in Wisconsin. So it was I'm sure, I imagine it was completely different from what I imagine what the U.S. was compared to what Laos and Thailand was. But it's a lot of Hmong folks are really drawn to the mountainous areas. So they really enjoy kind of the mountains and kind of the agriculture and just everything around those spaces.
Ger, thank you so much for sharing your work with our community.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We were speaking with Ger Xiong about his 2023 exhibition in the Red Penning Gallery, The Stories We Carry.